Our first case study is on the tar sands and pipeline campaigns along the Canadian-US border. And we have speaking Lara Skinner and Clayton Thomas Muller. Lara is the Associate Director of the Worker Institute at Cornell and the co-director of the Cornell Global Labor Institute. And Clayton is the co-director of the Indigenous Tar Sands Campaign, as well as an organizer with Defenders of the Land and on the National Steering Committee of Idle No More. So yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Thanks, Ethan. Okay, can you hear me okay? Good, okay. So I was asked to talk about exposing neoliberalism's weak spots and the sort of movement building and political program building opportunities and lessons that we can learn from the struggles around the tar sands and the pipelines related to the tar sands. And I'm going to speak from my experiences with the, which have been mostly around the Keystone XL pipeline and really building labor opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline and extreme energy. And then I'll turn it over to Clayton to talk more generally about tar sands development and the struggles against that and the critically important role that indigenous communities have played in those and are playing in those struggles. Just because I know that there may be some people here who are not familiar with the Keystone XL pipeline. It's a nearly 2,000-mile pipeline that will transport tar sands, crude oil from Alberta, Canada, down through the middle of the US to the Gulf Coast in Texas. It would transport about 900,000 barrels of crude oil per day. And in terms of the scale and sort of scope of what we're talking about, to get the tar sands oil, they sort of peel back the boreal forest, which is mostly on First Nations land or near First Nations land, and then use massive amounts of fresh water and water from aquifers, heat and chemicals to then get the tar sands oil out. Tar sands are the third largest petroleum source in the world. And the area available for extraction is about the size of the country of England. So that just gives you some sense of the scope. And in terms of, from a climate perspective, it produces about 3 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that conventional oil does. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, you know, the risk that's posed by tar sands development and these pipelines around air and water quality, around public health, around climate emissions, and First Nations and other communities' ways of life. So that's just to give you some perspective. And then I also should say that, you know, the Keystone XL is just one pipeline of many pipelines that are being proposed or are in the process of being built or attempts to convert them to transport tar sands oil. So if we win the battle on Keystone XL, it by no means means that we win the battle against climate change. And Clayton will talk more about that and the sort of multitude of tar sands pipelines that are being proposed, but mostly not built. So I think there's a few important reasons for us to look and see what we can learn from the Keystone XL struggle. One is that the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline has involved one of the most broad-based social movement struggles we've seen in the US in decades. So we're talking youth, students, labor, both unions and workers' organizations, indigenous people, communities along the pipeline route, farmers and ranchers, mainstream environmentalists, and the environmental justice and the climate justice movement. And so it's one of these rare opportunities where an issue affects a lot of different segments of society and provides us with a sort of good moment, a good opportunity to build movements and build alliances across communities of color, across white working class communities, across the environmental movement, across generations, across cultures. So it's been one of these rare opportunities for us to do movement building, and also to dispel the idea that the climate fight is a middle class white fight, environmentalist fight. And also, right, it's been a great opportunity to disrupt the capitalist system's plan to expand fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's kind of the larger context of it. I'd also say that the Keystone XL struggle has been interesting because of how much it's engaged highly participatory, direct action, civil disobedience in terms of fighting the pipeline. more civil disobedience than we've seen since the Vietnam War. And then third, after 5 years of resistance, the pipeline hasn't been built and it may not be built. Those are the reasons that we wanted to look at Keystone XL and the tar sands development and pipelines related to it more generally. In terms of my observations and what does the KXL struggle mean for movement building more broadly and building sort of a left pole for eco-socialism, I'll share a couple of my insights and then turn it over to Clayton. One, I think that KXL made it very clear and made the fossil fuel agenda very clear and made the ineffectiveness of the mainstream environmental movement's sort of top-down, legislative, market-based approach to the climate crisis very clear, and ultimately the failure of green capitalism very clear. And that's been an important part of this. It came on the heels of federal climate legislation failing, and mainstream environmental organizations who receive the vast majority of funding from the environmental foundation world spent millions trying to pass this bill without any success, for modest reductions in climate emissions and a lot of concerns around how these mechanisms would have impacted communities of color, working class communities. It made it really clear that we were not winning on climate legislation. We weren't making a transition to the renewables-based energy system that we needed to make. And instead, fossil fuel companies were using their wealth and power to actually expand the fossil fuel infrastructure and use extreme energy methods. And it's not just tar sands, it's surface mining for coal, it's hydrofracking for shale gas, it's deep sea, it's Arctic Sea oil drilling. So it's all of these things that are extremely risky to workers, communities, and the environment. So that's one point. I think that the failure of that bill and the opportunity that presented, then the proposal to build the Keystone XL pipeline, this horrific pipeline, sort of emboldened some segments of the labor and environmental movement to present more ambitious and realistic ways of addressing the climate crisis that could also address the economic and social crisis that we're dealing with and truly deliver on economic and environmental justice. I think the second point that I would focus on is that it created a rupture in the labor movement, and this rupture in the labor movement has actually been a really good thing. We had some unions that were strongly supporting the Keystone XL pipeline, and they were actually aligning themselves with the fossil fuel industry around expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure and extreme energy agenda, and acting as the sort of jobs front for this industry. And then we had a handful of unions who were publicly opposing the pipeline because of concerns around climate change, concerns around public health, and because they wanted to be in solidarity with indigenous communities, communities of color, others who would be most impacted by the construction of it. And it really sort of helped a lot of unions see that non-energy sector unions can weigh in on the climate and energy debates, and that this is everyone's issue, and they actually should indeed be weighing in on it and expanding their role beyond, the typical, wage and benefit negotiations that they've been doing since basically the Second World War. So that's been a good thing, this rupture in the labor movement around this. And then the third thing is that I think it's forced those of us on the left of the labor and environmental movement to ask ourselves, what are we proactively demanding around economic and environmental justice? So the KXL fight has been a really tough fight. It's only one fight. We know we're up against this extreme energy agenda, but in the meantime, joblessness is growing. The jobs versus environment frame is really powerful. Communities are suffering, and what is the alternative that we're putting out there that gets us to addressing the climate crisis, protecting workers and the environment, and getting us radical democracy and economic justice? So for those of us in labor, it became really clear to us that we needed to begin building an international community of unions that were calling for democratic social ownership of energy. That it was clear that we couldn't address the climate crisis, we couldn't protect workers and communities from the fossil fuel companies, we couldn't address energy poverty, we couldn't get community control of energy unless we had a decisive shift in power towards workers and communities, and this would require getting democratic social ownership of the energy sector. And so along with RLS New York City, Sean Sweeney and I at Cornell, we've been building this Trade Unions for Energy Democracy project. That is sort of the foundation of it. And we've had about 30 unions from 15 different countries now join this initiative and really start moving this agenda. I would also say that the Climate Justice Alliance's work on their Our Power and Just Transition campaigns are another one that is putting out a bold, comprehensive, compelling vision for a socially just, ecologically rooted society. And I can let Bill Gallegos and Cindy Weisner say more about those campaigns. And just finally on the mainstream environmental movement, I would say that despite being a part of this broad-based movement, having some success with the KXL struggle, their overall approach hasn't shifted. We're still seeing the focus on a sort of neoliberal, capitalist, market-based approach to addressing the climate crisis, reliant on deregulation, privatization, that's really harmful to workers and communities. So work to be done question about how much work we do to try to shift the approach of the mainstream environmental movement.
I think something to really take into consideration when we talk about the pipeline campaigns related to the tar sands is that everybody involved deserves a pat on the back. Historically in the world of campaigning, pipeline campaigns were always perceived that they were going to be built. They weren't really very sexy to fund, and through the good, dedicated, hard work of organizers, we've seen the tar sands campaign become probably the most visible campaign on the face of the planet. And the Keystone XL campaign, here in the lower 48 has demonstrated the fact that social movements in the belly of the beast have considerable amount of power, having pushed the State Department to delay the decision on KXL 4 times now, okay? So that's a real huge victory in and of itself. But, when we look at things, when we talk about tar sands, we gotta understand scale. There's 100,000 plus workers in the tar sands required to make that thing operate, all right? The tar sands represents probably one of the worst manifestations of the neoliberal agenda that exists on the planet, climate change being another. It's really important to understand that in Alberta, Alberta, Canada, they produce about 1.8 million barrels per day in the tar sands, but they have 6 million barrels per day capacity already having gone through the approvals process, and the only thing that they're waiting for is the capacity to get it to market, all right? And so the Keystone XL is one of about half a dozen pipeline proposals that sit on the table, and mark my words, within the next year or two, we'll probably see a pipeline proposal to Tuktoyaktuk, to take advantage of the open Arctic Ocean from sea ice. I guarantee it. And so when we understand the fact that there's 5 million barrels of tar sands ready to go, it's real easy to get caught up in all of the propaganda, and one of them being, of course, trains versus pipelines. There's a lot of increase in the oil by rail all across the continent. Many of you have seen the horrific tragedy in Lake Mégantic in Canada with the exploding Bakken oil trains. Well, there's a lot of train by oil coming out of tar sands too. And we can't get caught up in those polarized debates, because if you look at industry's data, they want all the train capacity, and they want all 6 of those pipelines with where they want to go. These tar sands pipeline proposals are about hardwiring our economy into a dirty oil economy for the next century. And it's really important to understand that scale, okay? This is like New World Order game-ending crap that we're dealing with, all right? I can't speak to the situation with labor here in the United States. I was in Congress and saw the debates in the Senate Standing Committees hearings. I saw some of the pipeline and fitters unions get up and advocate on behalf of the American Petroleum Institute. And one thing I can say, however, is that things are radically different in Canada. Now, Unifor, the biggest union in the country, which represents tar sands workers, has passed some very progressive resolutions in the last year at their launch. They committed to investing 10% of their overhead into politicizing their base from the locals to the national, which is a considerable amount of resources. And we've seen the explosion of Indigenous peoples' social movement organizing through the Idle No More movement, which has provided tremendous hope. And I guess one thing that I want to say that the pipeline campaigns that I want to just leave you all with, and then we can get into it more for those of you that come to our group here, is that your grandchildren will be campaigning against pipelines and refinery upgrades and shipping lanes if we don't stop this at the source, okay? We need to support frontline communities in Alberta, and we need to support workers impacted by the transition away from fossil fuels. And in Canada, we've only got 30 million people in the country. And out of those 30 million people, we have 2 million Indigenous peoples. And, strategies that we focus on moving forward, the pipeline campaigns provided us with great base building corridors to politicize communities, workers, everybody in the path of those pipelines. It provided us with an organizing path, okay? And we're in a situation now where we've got a considerable reinvigoration. As she mentioned, the KXL has brought to us civil disobedience unparalleled since the Vietnam War, I guess is what they call it. But it's really important, like I said, that we understand that our strategy here has got to be economic in focus, okay? If we're not organizing in a way that stops business as usual, then it's just going to continue to happen, all right? And so in Canada, we have a tremendous opportunity being the largest foreign energy provider to the United States. We've got the social movement infrastructure that's been established through Idle No More to launch what I believe is the 21st century social movement partnership between the true owners of the resources, Indigenous peoples, and the workers of the country, all right? And if those two groups get together, it's my belief that all other social movement sectors will fall in line and come into play. And I look forward to talking more about the collaboration between the labor movement and Indigenous people's social movement in our breakout group.
Okay.